Longevity Junkie. It's time to get your fix. I'm Nikki Lee.
I'm Buck Jeffrey.
And today we talk with Dr. Staci Gruber, a leading neuroscientist and expert on cannabis research, about her groundbreaking work exploring how cannabis affects the brain and how evidence-based science is reshaping public understanding and clinical applications. Also, we have the world's largest organ imaging data set, unlocking a new era of AI-powered aging research that could predict disease and even lifespan. But first, of course, let's catch up. Buck, you went on a trip.
I did. I went to Mexico City. It was cool. It was just it's a very cool city. The food is spectacular.
Yeah, you eat well there. It's expensive though, no? Or did you find
really? Well,
good restaurants like
not
the
when
big?
if you go to like the really nice restaurants, like we went to some, then you're going to be paying U.S. prices, but it's not
right.
It's like going to a nice restaurant in the U.S., but you can also during the day and stuff, it's kind of crazy how cheap stuff is there. But the thing was that I don't think I've ever thought I could be sick of Mexican food because I love Mexican food. But by day 4, it was like, oh my God, I can't take this anymore. We went to an Italian restaurant, I think.
Oh, really?
Day 5, because the girls were like, can we just have pasta?
Oh.
And so, yeah, but it was good. How about you? You're leaving again somewhere.
Yeah, I leave. Yeah, in a few days, I'm going to Spain with my mom.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to a place I've never been in Spain because I've been to Spain a lot, but mostly in like Barcelona or Ibiza or Mallorca. But this time I'm going on the other side where Portugal is, and it's called Bilbao, Spain.
Oh,
so
cool.
Yeah, and they have this Guggenheim Museum that the architecture and everything is like spectacular. I'm really excited to just witness something so grand.
Cool.
Yeah. I know. I'm super excited.
Yeah. Let's get on with this interesting thing you were talking about. What's this all about, this body?
Oh, yeah.
thing?
The organ imaging data set. Okay, so a massive milestone in longevity research just quietly dropped. The UK Biobank was completed 100,000 full-body MRI and CT scans, creating the world's largest database of internal organ images, now freely available to scientists worldwide. This unprecedented imaging project allows researchers to track how real bodies age over time, revealing hidden disease patterns and aging signatures across the brain, the heart, the liver, fat, and even muscles. Already, it's linked alcohol consumption to brain shrinkage and found early signs of cancer years before diagnosis. Combined with AI, this data is training tools that can detect aneurysms, metabolic dysfunction, and even predict lifespan. The next phase, scanning 60,000 participants a second. Time to map how lifestyle, environment, and genetics drive physical aging. And for longevity scientists, this is a gold mine, offering the clearest window yet into how bodies deteriorate and why some organs age faster than others, and how maybe to slow it down altogether.
Well, it's cool. It's basically, what we're seeing is all the results of AI, right? And the way they're doing this is actually not different from the way we think of biological or epigenetic age, those biological clocks. They do it the same way. The only difference is instead of using the results of MRIs, what they're looking at is blood markers. So if you're looking at a blood marker of millions of people, you can look at various patterns that are associated with being, say, 75 years old or being 80 years old or 20 years old. And so what you're doing with a biological clock is essentially when you give your blood, you're basically just saying, okay, we'll match it up with your typical person who has my blood markers. And if it's, somebody who's 75 years old and you're 30, that means probably things are not going well for you. So this is a similar thing here, but now we're looking at, instead of blood markers, we're looking at it as actual physical changes that you can see with MRI. So I think these kinds of things are incredibly powerful, and yeah, it's going to lead to a lot more useful information over time.
Oh, totally. I mean, I love, so they're gathering like hundreds of thousands of different images and like CT scans of different organs, right? And then just compare analysis of like what's healthy at this age and things like that. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
so it's just basically creating sort of this like database that then the artificial intelligence can kind of look at and make correlations. That's really what AI is all about. So anyway, cool stuff for sure. It's exciting.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by neuroscientist, professor, and cannabis researcher expert, Dr. Staci Gruber. Welcome back to Longevity Junkie. It's time for our guest interview. It's the breakdown with Dr. Staci Gruber. Dr. Staci Gruber is a cognitive neuroscientist and associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, where she leads pioneering research on the impact of cannabis on the brain. She's the director of the MIND, Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery program at McLean Hospital, one of the first studies of its kind to explore both recreational and medical cannabis using advanced neuroimaging and cognitive assessments. Widely respected for her evidence-based, data-driven approach, Dr. Gruber is committed to separating myth from fact in the cannabis conversation. Welcome to the show, Dr. Gruber.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, for me, it's my pleasure because I'm really interested in this space to know, is this healthy for us or not healthy for us?
Such a good question. So many answers, actually. So, yeah.
I'm sure. And you've been at the forefront of cannabis and brain science for years. What pulled you into this space in the first place? And how has the research world changed now from cannabis going mainstream?
So it's a really good question. I have been at it for years. We won't say how many years because it's way too many to count at this point, but way more than half my life, let's just say. And, long ago and far away, we started off looking at the impact of recreational cannabis. Most of what we know about cannabis comes from studies of recreational consumers. Primarily young, healthy recreational consumers, as it turns out. That's a really important thing when we start thinking about more recent questions about medical cannabis use, because they're not the same. But, first, we really spent a long time looking at the impact of recreational cannabis in people who were using early in their lives, let's say before age 16, and then people who were starting a little bit later to see if there were any differences in things like cognitive performance or your ability to do tasks, maybe in brain structure or function, in mood, all those kinds of things. So that's really where my journey began. And I joined some studies that were already in progress 3 million years ago, literally. No kidding, but a long time ago. A long time ago. And yes, we've certainly seen cannabis re-legalized in this country. People sometimes don't realize that cannabis was legal in this country. In 1850, it was part of our pharmacopoeia. So
wow.
Doctors didn't have the ability to give you a recommendation or a certification for it. It was a prescription. And you could go to a drugstore and have it filled for various conditions and indications. And some of the original memorabilia I happen to own is amazing because it tells you all the things on the side of a bottle that you might be able to use it for, including a feeling of general contentment, which is amazing, right?
That's actually very true.
It's really true. And,
right.
It was, like I say, part of this pharmacopoeia. And in 1937, it was made illegal and it fell out of favor. In 1942, they pulled it from the pharmacopoeia. And in 1970, it became part of the Controlled Substance Act. It was placed in the most restrictive class, Schedule 1, where it remains today. At the federal level, this is illegal. Yeah.
So we were in the midst of prohibition for many years, I guess.
Indeed.
And there you go, right? But listen, now there's a lot of noise out there now. People calling cannabis either panacea or poison, and it's a very polarized discussion, even amongst, I think, people who study this stuff. Right? We've got people on there like Dr. Daniel Amen, who is very much against marijuana in terms of anything related to the brain. When you look at it, obviously, this is what you spend your time on. What's the evidence say about how cannabis really affects our brain function over time? And maybe, I think you mentioned some differences, whether, you're starting early or starting late and all that, but what does the evidence tell us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, again, you're 1,000% right. It's a very polarizing topic. I've never met anybody who goes, meh, I don't know, I'm kind of in the middle. No one says that. They're either all in or all out. And the truth is, age matters. We are not all created equally. And when you are an adolescent or even an emerging adult, your brain is still very much under development, under construction, or for my cannabis folks, half-baked, right? So you are neurodevelopmentally vulnerable during adolescence. And as you come along, the brain develops from the back to the front and from the bottom to the top. And we understand at this point that the brain continues to grow throughout the second and even into the third decade of life. So we assumed long ago and far away that we were done by the time we hit puberty. Not true. But by the time we're about mid-20s or so, most people assume that most of it's done. So what is the impact of using something like cannabis early, let's say age 15, versus somebody who's in their 30s or 40s and using it? So the answer is it depends. And what we know from our studies of recreational consumers is that folks who are beginning regular, consistent patterns of use early on during that period of vulnerability, there may be some decrements or changes, some challenges with performing some of those tasks, some differences in brain structure or function. But it's not all one size fits all. And when people begin using later, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, now you're in the sort of strictly more medical realm very often, right? We don't see the same types of things at all. And in fact, we've noticed that certain things seem to improve and not get worse over time. That's really important when we think about brain health.
So what are those consistent changes that you've seen, whether that's being the detrimental effects of the teen who starts chronically partaking in marijuana by 15 versus somebody who's 40 and starting to use then for medical purposes?
So there are different patterns that we see. So in our younger consumers who are using recreationally, we often have noted and reported, not just me, but colleagues across the country and the globe, challenges with tasks that require the frontal cortex, the part of your brain that actually comes online last, right behind your eyebrows, responsible for things like inhibiting impulsive behaviors or, making good sound decisions. And sadly, it's also the first part of the brain to go as we age. That's why very young people and very old people often look similar. There's no ability to inhibit inappropriate responses, right? They may say something that may not be appropriate. Little kids and older people, very often, it's an issue of not having frontal inhibition. So we often see challenges with tasks like that in people who are chronic, heavy cannabis users who start early. So you would expect that over time, that may look a certain way. In individuals who begin using cannabis later in life, not only do we not see the same types of decrements, we often see improvements in those same types of tasks. We're looking at people over time, longitudinal studies. So we look at people before they begin using, and then after a period of, let's say, 3 months, 6 months, 12, all the way out now to 5 years. And we look at their performance on these tasks, and we aren't seeing the same kinds of decrements. We either see patterns of stable performance or improvements. More importantly, though, I would tell you that one of the things we saw in younger cannabis folks was compromised white matter integrity. So your brain is gray matter, white matter, and CSF. And gray matter is the hardworking neurons. White matter connects brain region to brain region for good communication. So what we found was that earlier onset cannabis users had decreased white matter organization or coherence. What we wanted is coherent fiber tract integrity. Really interesting. When we started looking at our medical cannabis folks, and we're the first ever to do neuroimaging of these people longitudinally, we found increases in white matter organization and coherence over time. I didn't expect that after only 3 months of use. That's really quite stunning. That's a structural brain change. That is a positive development that is directly opposite, what we might expect in our recreational folks.
How does something essentially be neurotoxic in one sense and, affecting these axonal connections and at the same time be, positive for neuroplasticity?
So I guess what I would say is that age matters, and it depends where you are in the developmental.
But I mean, mechanistically, I'm just curious what you're.
So mechanistically, when your brain is developing, there are all sorts of things that are changing as a function of, let's say, white matter fiber tracts. And we have there are a series of events, right? These pruning events where we get rid of things that we're not using, et cetera. And the brain during adolescence and emerging adulthood isn't just sensitive or vulnerable to cannabis. It's any substance, alcohol, injury. It's just vulnerable. As we get older and we're actually coming around on the other side, now we're in danger of losing certain things. What you're very often talking about is allowing more efficient processing to happen. And I think we don't necessarily understand all the nuances related. I'll tell you the truth. If you're a neuroimaging person, you try to keep your scanning parameters the same. Baseline, 3 months, 6 months, 12, you want to do the same scanning sequences because you want to compare them. I didn't really expect to see anything on these diffusion tensor imaging or DTI scans necessarily at 3 months. What are we going to see? When we saw that there were increases in white matter fiber tract integrity, I scoured the literature. And the only thing I'll tell you is in studies of patients with psychosis who had been treatment refractory, so people who were not necessarily responding to conventional antipsychotics, when they finally had a medication that effectively treated their symptoms, very often white matter coherence improved. So it may
Oh,
very
wow.
well be that once you're treating certain types of symptoms, you actually get this result. I think it's early on in the game to know that it's one study. We're certainly continuing to expand and collect this data, so we'll know more as we move forward. But certainly that's very promising. To not see decrements when adults who are not using cannabis add cannabis that is used for medical purposes versus recreation. We'll get to that probably because they're very different types of goals, right? And goals drive your product selection, and your product selection drives the outcome. So I think these things all go hand in hand.
Now, you were saying that there were some benefits or improvements from smoking marijuana. I know you were saying the white matter, but is there any other specific improvement that you can shine the light on?
Sure. What I would say is, first of all, smoking and vaping is one way, right? One route of administration is inhalation. So people smoke or vape. Lots of folks in our clinical trials, not the longitudinal observational studies, but clinical trials where I actually create a product to address chronic pain, anxiety, symptoms related to other things, perhaps. That's very different. So they could be using in any one of, or several ways. What we've noticed overwhelmingly is that from baseline, when people aren't using cannabis, and then following them over the course of a year, remember that we talk to them every month and we have these milestone visits, and they complete these very comprehensive assessments of mood. So measures of things like anxiety, depression. We look at things like cognitive performance, obviously, sleep, quality of life, where we can, imaging. But really, really interesting, we see clinical change over time that's pretty striking. And again, in the observational studies, people are using their own products their own way. So we don't tell them what to use or how to use it. We have samples of their most commonly used products analyzed by an outside lab. So I know, quote, what's in their weed, because I can't just rely on a label necessarily. We know that's not a great idea. And it really does appear that over time, what we generally see are clinical improvements that are really quite striking. Changes in conventional medication use. So people on their own are reducing their use of things like opioids or benzodiazepines for things like pain or sleep or anxiety. That's pretty important. Change in conventional medication use, reductions in things like anxiety or depressive symptoms, and then improvements in certain areas like sleep and cognitive performance are pretty compelling.
Now, what are the usage amount exactly? Like, are they smoking it, little hits in the morning, some in the afternoon, some at night? Is it consistent? What's the usage amount?
So everybody's use and regimen differs, right? So it's really important to have a way of being able to compare. So think about all the different product types around, across the platforms, right? So you can have a joint, a spliff, a blunt, you could be dabbing. Those are just routes of inhalation, right? You could have a bong. You could then use an edible. You could use a cookie, a candy, a sublingual tincture, a capsule, a lots of variable. So we created a metric called can account. Get it? Can account, where we can compare exactly, let's say, how much exposure an individual is having to a product that's, let's say, got X amount of CBD, X amount of THC, CBN, CBC, all the constituents that we're interested in looking at. And there are, cannabis has over 500 compounds inherent to the plant. 120 or so are phytocannabinoids. There's actually a multitude of terpenes, these essential oils that also have a behavioral health effect. So in terms of what people are doing, we have average use, and most people are using at least daily or multiple times a day. They're not generally smoking or vaping. Very often they're using other types of products, but sometimes they are. And so the type of product that they choose also varies. So we calculate what we call exposure, how much THC they may be exposed to on a weekly basis, how much CBD, how much CBN, how much, all of these things. And that matters. And that helps guide our clinical trials. That helps me know what I should be aiming for when I'm creating a product, let's say, to address chronic pain or anxiety.
You bring up a good point. Obviously, you put a good point. But just talk about, CBD versus THC, right? Like this is one of the things I think is, or any other of these other chemicals that you're talking about, because, we've addressed this podcast so far as cannabis, but that's a big umbrella of different chemicals. And so when you talk about, for example, I think there's an interest in neuroinflammation. where are the majority of the benefits coming from? I mean, presumably more CBD related, but kind of break it down for us.
I think some of those things depend on, quote, what ails you, like what condition we talk about, because they're different. And to your point, and it's a very good one, I wish everybody were as informed as you are. Cannabis is not one thing. We tend to use the word cannabis or marijuana to describe anything at all that comes from the plant Cannabis sativa L. And that's unfortunate. Like I said, over 500 compounds. And it's not just THC is the primary intoxicating constituent of the plant that's primarily prized by our recreational consumers. And again, no judgment. We live in a judgment-free zone. You want to be high or altered? Muzzle. Wonderful. Great. But know what you want before you use a product. CBD is a prominent, but not the only non-intoxicating constituent of the plant. There are lots and lots, dozens and dozens of other cannabinoids, as well as terpenes, flavonoids. And it turns out that for some things, a combination of specific compounds is incredibly helpful, right? So some people will tell you, higher amounts of, let's say, CBD may be more helpful for anxiety, for example, than higher amounts of THC. We know this because studies, primarily, again, in recreational consumers, tell us that small amounts of THC may be helpful for anxiety for some people. For some people, even small amounts are too much. But in very high doses, for almost everybody, it can be anxiety producing. So we want to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That doesn't mean
paranoia.
oh yeah, absolutely. Too high
Especially when it
frequency.
was illegal.
I think that depending on what the marketplace is, regardless of where you're getting it, a lot of it has to do with what your frame of mind is. I think you addressed this earlier, sort of like how, what you're looking for, what else is on board? Is there alcohol on board? What other medications are on board? Your state of mind, your experience, your genetic profile, all critically important. But to your point, CBD is often touted for its medical properties. And, it's certainly been an extraordinary journey so far. There are other cannabinoids that are incredibly impressive. And, we often hear that THC is sort of vilified, like, oh no, stay away, it's horrible. Well, there are certainly a number of things that it's been proven to be helpful with, right? And so you can't throw everything into the same bucket, and you can't consider everything in the same way. It's not one size fits all, or even one size fits most.
When you're
Right.
when you're using these, when you're studying this, and especially, you're creating some correlation. So, for example, what's happening in the brain. You talk about white matter changes and things like that. It becomes, I would imagine, that's like one of the major challenges, right? Like, what is it specifically that is resulting in that, so that you can sort of take that data and use it for good.
Right. One of the problems is, despite the fact that California re-legalized medical cannabis in 1996, there's no long-term data on medical cannabis use, like none. When Massachusetts, which is where my home state, was on the precipice of legalizing cannabis for medical purposes in 2012, I scoured the literature. I thought, okay, let's see what we know, so we can kind of compare what we know from our recreational consumers and see how it compares. And the stunning and unfortunate fact was I didn't find much, really nothing. Nothing where cognition, your ability to perform these tasks, was primary. Nothing that really focused on long-term over time assessments, if you will. So you take somebody, you follow them over time. These are really important. And if you don't do that, right, imagine you want to look at real-world patients using real-world products for real-world problems, so that we know what works, what doesn't work, and then we can actually focus specifically when we're going to create products that we use in clinical trials. Again, to your point, a clinical trial, I know exactly what the patient is getting because I made it. Literally, I'm making it. And they're taking it, and I look at them beforehand and after, and then we know. These are considered the gold standard, although observational data really point us in the right direction. And without that, we have very little. So those kinds of data are very important. And we shouldn't be the only ones who have this kind of data in the country. I'm delighted and mortified, right? We should have a lot more of this, where we can follow people and know what they're using and what works and what doesn't. And we can get an idea. That can account, that metric tells us, hey, look, the majority of people that we see are using products that are higher in non-intoxicating cannabinoids than things like THC, probably because their goal is to address medical symptoms, not to be altered or high. And that's the first question you always ask people. Know before you go. Be honest with yourself. What's the goal? If the goal is to sleep through the night, to address pain, to feel less anxious, that is probably going to result in you making different decisions about your products than kind of want to blow it out with my friends this weekend. Again, no judgment, but very, very different types of products, right?
So, what is the real difference between recreational and medical cannabis when it comes to brain health? Is there one actually better for you?
So I think that most people would tell you again, it depends on when you're talking about it, right? So when we think about children, adolescents, emerging adults who are still very much under construction or, half-baked, exposure to high levels of THC, which is generally what you see in recreational products. There's no recreational
Okay.
product in the marketplace that's designed to not get you altered or high. That's the point. Like, people want their money back when they say, "Oh gosh, I got my mother's CBD product. This isn't going to do anything." They're not happy with it. So I think most people at this point have basically agreed that in a developing brain, an organism that's not quite, done, high amounts of things like THC are not great. It doesn't turn out that high amounts of CBD are necessarily deleterious. We don't have a ton of data, but THC is biologically reinforcing, which means it activates reward circuitry in your brain. These areas in your brain that are going, yum, give me more, whether it's sugar or sex your brain's reward circuitry lights up for lots of things. And when we worry about people misusing, that's generally why. CBD doesn't activate reward circuitry. So it's not biologically reinforcing. So when we think about what's quote better for your brain, I'm not sure it's rec versus med or, med being infinitely preferable to rec, depending on what you're using. It depends. What's in your weed, I say. That's the question. That's the question.
I love that. Do you think cannabis can protect your brain as you age, or does it speed up cognitive decline?
Again, I think that in individuals who are beyond that period of neurodevelopmental vulnerability, there's every reason to believe, especially for the non-intoxicating cannabinoids, things like cannabidiol, cannabichromene, cannabigerol, cannabinol, all have been touted for potential beneficial effects. And people are starting to add them to their health and wellness regimens, not just for, quote, what ails you, but what's going to keep you healthy. That's different from high levels of THC starting, early on and going all throughout your life. I think not everybody will show decrements, but certainly when we see them, they're more likely related to that than not. And I certainly think there's a fair amount of preclinical or basic evidence. So data that we acquire either from animal studies or just chemistry that suggests there's a fair amount to be excited about with regard to neuroprotection. That's really fascinating.
One of the things you kind of mentioned, which actually surprised me, though, is actually potentially enhancing memory because the stereotype of the pot user is not being able to find your pot, right? I mean, so you're finding that in adults who are using, and I guess THC as well as any other kind of cannabis, it actually can be beneficial for your memory and cognitive function.
So, cognitive performance is split into all these different domains, right? So we have frontal executive function, then we have memory, we have all these different subcategories. And I think it's probably not the case that every single thing is good for everything across the board. I think that in general, again, higher levels of THC for most people is not necessarily great at facilitating memory. That may be true. It may be good for other things. I think that when we look at individuals who are dialing down inflammatory processes, individuals who are addressing symptoms related to things like pain or an inability to sleep through the night, what you wind up with is people who are feeling better and then ultimately doing better. Now, I don't know that I would say it's a direct result. Like, you give this cannabinoid or this combination and directly you see this cognitive performance change. Or is it more likely a function of they're sleeping better, they have less pain, they're not as anxious, and then they perform better on these tasks?
Right. You sleep better and boom, all of a sudden you've got significantly improved cognitive function, which makes
or you're taking fewer conventional medications that wind up resulting in a cognitive hangover the day after you take it, right? So all of these things are super important and, sort of weigh into we need to consider these things together. But it's certainly not what people have traditionally thought. Cannabis isn't one thing. And so when you say good or bad, I always go, it depends. I don't know.
Do you think cannabis could be the next longevity drug?
So I will tell you, and I mean this, really quite seriously, there are people who spend a lot of time looking at the optimal combinations of different compounds to increase their quality of life, decrease inflammatory processes, all these things, right? Oxidative stress, we hear about this all the time. As we age, biologically, biology is cruel, make no mistake about it. All right. Oxidative stress plagues every one of us. And can we somehow, like Cher, if I could turn back time, could we possibly roll back inflammation? Could we dial it down? If there are things that we know that we can harness to reduce inflammatory processes, like some of the cannabinoids appear to be able to do, even some of the quasi-endocannabinoids, things like PEA. Would you do it? I think most people would. Does that mean you're going to actually live longer, feel better, live healthier? I think there's a trade-off. Most people I know would rather feel better and live longer than just one or the other, right? So I absolutely think that cannabis, or more appropriately termed cannabinoids, are factoring into people's decisions about health and well-being more often now than not.
You started the MIND program, which is one of the only long-term studies on cannabis and the brain. What are some of your biggest surprises or breakthroughs that you've seen come out of it so far?
Just to clarify, so it's the only longitudinal study focused on medical cannabis, only because there are studies that look at recreational cannabis longitudinally, and we never want to take anything away from those folks. But it's studies that nobody is looking at medical patients for years and years. First of all, you want the same folks, and you want to get them. The one big distinction is you want to get them before they start using cannabis for medical purposes. Otherwise, the baseline becomes a slippery slope. So that's important. I think that, it's been an incredible journey so far, and looking at the change over time, again, in the longitudinal observational studies where people are choosing their own product, creating their own regimen, simply reporting to us how they feel, what they feel, all these things, and then performing these tasks, completing these brain scans. It's certainly not the case that we're seeing all sorts of cognitive decline in people once they had any kind of cannabis, high in CBD or not. They're doing poorly. We're not seeing that at all. We're seeing either stable or improved cognitive performance, and certainly improvements in things like quality of life, sleep, and a lot of clinical measures across the board, which is really quite encouraging.
For those people who started pot early in their teens, they hit it hard. If they stop, is there any sort of catching up in those connections that have been lost? I kind of think of like what they used to say about, as a physician and smoking, that if you don't smoke for about 5 years, you're pretty much caught up with the non-smokers at that point. Is there anything like that when it comes to early use of pot?
Absolutely. So people will talk about what we call harm reduction strategies. So how can we reduce harm? And one of them is to reduce or stop using, right? And it's hard to sometimes get those messages across to adolescents or emerging adults. We know that the message, just say no, did not work. We tried the message. Yeah, Nancy Reagan. Thank you, Nancy. May she rest in peace. We try a message that's more aligned with just not yet. You are an adult for a long time. So maybe give yourself a chance to develop and then think about it. Or if you're going to use it, maybe not anything that's, got a THC level that's higher than X. But yes, I think there have been a number of studies that look at cessation. So people who are abstinent for periods of time, weeks or months or longer. And in fact, cognitive performance does appear to return. Different types of brain changes may also sort of result and sort of, quote, normalize. I don't know that everything goes back to baseline for every person, but certainly not every person looks like they have any decrements anyway. So yes, that message is an important one for people who might be willing. And again, later on, we don't necessarily expect the same results as we see in earlier folks.
All right, I want to ask like a personal question. How do you smoke weed and not feel groggy the next morning?
That's a good question. This is a really good question. So first of all, it depends on what you're smoking.
Okay, so what should I smoke?
Oh, well, I think it really depends on your goal. And some people find that, again, cannabis is this remarkable plant, right? So we have all these different chemovars or cultivar strains, if you will, right? So different products ostensibly confer different effects for you. And it may be that something that is not quite as high in just THC, but has some other compounds in it, may reduce that. That's very often the case. Some people find that there are ways to mitigate that by doing it a little bit earlier rather than later. Some people decide they're going to, use some other products in conjunction. There's different ways to do it. If you're smoking generally is what we call the fastest rise time. So time to get an effect, routes of inhalation. So you smoke or you inhale, it goes into your lungs, into the bloodstream, into the brain. That also generally translates to the shortest duration of effect. So sometimes it's a question of when you're using it and maybe dial down the amount of THC you're looking for. People have a tendency to look for super heavy hitters, like they want something very
Yeah.
heavy hitting. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily always the right way to go. You may not need that. And you can always add. You can never take away. Once you've used it, you can't unuse it. You can't, get rid of it so easily. So, maybe see how you feel after a little bit. But experimentation is key. Using products with a more varied constituent profile is also really critical to try to avoid that. So,
Mm. And then I have a question. Now we have all these vapes, right? Like this electronic heating up of weed. And in my opinion, I don't think that that's healthy. Like I think smoking like the flower is going to be better than any sort of electronic heating up. Do you have any insight on that?
So, there's been a long-standing debate about smoking versus vaping. And some people will tell you that vaping, which is designed to be just below the point of combustion, so you're not actually inhaling things like bits of paper or anything else that's like in the pipe or anything like that, or actual material, slightly better for your lungs, maybe. There's a whole debate about it. And I think there are all sorts of compounds that you're exposed to during routes of inhalation at all. I think some people enjoy vaping flower. Some people enjoy vaping oil because of the convenience of it. But the most important thing here, really, truly, and I think you're sort of alluding to this, how the product came to be. So some products are manufactured through the use of solvents. And unless those solvents are purged 100% from the final product, I worry about that kind of exposure. That's a problem, especially in our younger folks, right? So think about it. When we think about certain types of concentrates, some require the use of solvents to create them, right? And so if you're dabbing or something, you're also exposing yourself to things like hexane or butane. No, thank you. I think that's not a great idea. This is also true of products that are considered semi-synthetic, so the so-called Delta 8 products, right? These products are not naturally occurring in the plant. Delta 8 occurs in the plant in infinitesimally small amounts. To get a heavy Delta 8 product, you basically have to convert CBD heavy biomass. So a plant that was harvested for its CBD is then converted chemically into something that's high in Delta 8, blah, 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 this whole thing. Again, a good friend of mine is the head of a lab here in Massachusetts and will attest repeatedly to the fact that over 95% of the products that he sees still have solvents remaining in them. That's a problem.
How do you make sure, like if you go to a weed store or dispensary or whatever, how can you find the ones that don't have the solvents versus the ones, like, is there a question to ask or what to look for?
Well, first, you can use products that don't require solvents. There are ways of extracting these things that don't require solvents. So something that says solventless, or, people can explore the differences between rosin and resin and all these types of things. And it's important. It's really important. You can also ask for a certificate of analysis or a COA. That's a laboratory result page that tells you not only what the cannabinoid constituent profile is, which is where I live and breathe, but also the presence of pesticides, heavy metals, aflatoxins, yeast, mold. All these things are important. Most of the time, if they're willing to give you one, it won't have failed for anything. So, third-party testing is best, not testing from the manufacturer. That's usually also a good way of going about it. So,
Right.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. There's so much to learn on this subject, and it's so controversial.
Where can people learn more about your work, and I guess just in general, sort of more general information like you're giving us? Because I think, there's a lot of people who are smoking pot, especially now that it's legal. It's, I don't know how many more people are smoking pot because it's legal, but certainly they're talking about it more. And what are good resources for people to check out, including your own?
So starting with our own, I think it's the mindprogram.org or drstacigruber.com takes you to our lab. And the Mind Program has its own page with different news articles and different pieces of information. We try to put all sorts of things up there that are helpful for people because I think, to your point, people don't necessarily have the basic resources that they should have. And they're often, if they go to a dispensary, they're often in the hands of very well-intended bud tenders or patient care advocates who may not really necessarily know what they need to know to help guide a patient. If a patient is using a product, for example, people often say, well, CBD is so, benign. There's no real concern about it. It's generally recognized as safe or GRAS according to, what's the big deal? Turns out that CBD, like other cannabinoids, interacts with your liver and the cytochrome P450 enzyme system. is incredibly important for processing all drugs. So you could inadvertently, by using a very heavy CBD product, you could inadvertently increase certain other drugs in your system or decrease. It affects your liver enzymes. You can elevate your liver function tests. There are things to be mindful of. So we try to give people
Wow.
things like that, but it's important to stay on top of that. I wish there was a mandatory educational module people had to complete before they,
I
they
know.
started giving advice to people. People can seek help from canna consultants, cannasultant, I would call it, like I'm a connoisseur, right? Really, really helpful and important. I think people have to take things into their own hands at the moment because most healthcare providers or practitioners are following what patients are doing. And that's a lot of what I see, the ideas that I come up with in terms of the latest, greatest, in terms of oncology or patients with bipolar disorder, the first ever study in patients with bipolar disorder, finally underway. Hooray. Comes from my work directly with patients and seeing what the clinical need is, not the other way around. Like, hey, I made this discovery. We should try it in these folks. So it's important for people to try to be educated. It's important for people to not just read a headline, what's great and what's terrible about cannabis. Read the whole
Right.
thing.
Right. Is there any persistent myths that you can debunk or illuminate right now off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, the number one myth I would tell you is recreational and medical cannabis are the same. No, I would tell you that's a myth. So the plant doesn't give a crap what you use it for, right? The plant's the plant. Remarkable. Plant doesn't care. And the products may even be the same, but the goal of use, that is to address things like, again, sleep disruption or chronic pain or anxiety or mood disruption, is going to dictate a different type of use relative to somebody who's looking to be high. They're just different.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's a very, very important distinction. So when someone says, listen, I'm against all marijuana for brain health, I have to say, well, hold on a second. Let's look at preclinical data that shows, quote, middle-aged and older adult rats, if you will, outperformed young rats after being administered tiny amounts of THC. That's because the aging endocannabinoid system sometimes may need a tweak. What do you say to that? So it all depends. It's never one size fits all.
Right.
That's the thing.
I
That's the
love
other-
that.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for being on the show
My
and
pleasure.
giving us a little bit of this,
So much
you know,
insight.
so much insight on,
My
on
pleasure.
something that I think a lot of people are interested in.
Anytime.
sure.
Happy to do it anytime. Any more questions, feel free to let me know.
I would love that.
Thank you.
So much. Are you on social media, Instagram?
Of course.
Or anything?
At Dr. Staci Gruber on Twitter, on Instagram.
Perfect.
We're
I'll
around,
shout out
so-
some questions to you.
Perfect. I'll answer them. You get to send me an email. So anytime.
Oh, yay. I'll love that. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Of course.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with our healthy takeout. Welcome back to Longevity Junkie. It's time for our healthy takeout. Well, what did you think, Buck? I'm excited we got to talk to her.
I am too. It's actually
Yeah.
one of the more interesting shows I feel like we've done in a while because it's something that, it's out there. People are using it all day. And I actually, frankly, didn't know much about some of the positive stuff, especially as it comes to the brain. I mean, I generally thought brain, cannabis negative. Well, CBD, you'd heard that there's always some positives there potentially. But it is an interesting area. I think people probably should make sure that they learn a lot more about this stuff before they sort of become cannabis Jesus, so and start pushing it on everybody.
I mean, it totally makes sense to me based on what I've learned from Dr. Amen and his brain information that smoke is not good for a developing brain.
Yeah.
Smoke's not good for a brain at all, to be honest, but definitely when we're talking, with Dr. Gruber, like a developing brain, that's where it gets tricky.
Isn't he
and not
pretty
necessarily-
anti-marijuana then, though, in
He's
general
yes,
for the brain?
yes,
Yeah.
he's anti alcohol and marijuana. Marijuana mostly because of the smoke. Like smoke really can deteriorate your brain, and just like
Sure.
alcohol does
Sure.
shrinkage. But I do believe what Dr. Gruber is saying about the white matter, and I get more creative when I'm smoking, or if I, even some social aspects, like I let go of that filter of worry, like how am I showing up in front of this person? Like it just kind of allows me, I feel, to be a little more free. It allows me to be more creative and have I don't know, just a better flow of I don't know, I guess just like synaptic. But I like
I,
weed personally.
I
But
hear
I
you.
love that
Yeah.
there's, yeah. I'm
The
like, thank you for helping
bottom
me.
line is, I like weed.
Bottom line, I do. I
Uh,
do. But I love the amount of learning that the amount of THC is really important. So, like, you don't want to because I've been going to dispensaries lately and I've been seeing that they will share with you the percentage of THC. And at first I was like, I don't give I really don't care. But now knowing what she has said and how there is a reward circuitry enhancement, which I totally agree with and understand. I want to be able to be a little bit more specific about my,
yeah. Well,
THC percentage.
THC is the actual feeling of being high, right? CBD doesn't give you any of that. So
Right.
the THC is the stuff that actually gives you the psychoactive, the actual recreational use. So the other thing I would say that is a big take home here, and I think something to think about for parents, for example, is there's a huge difference between young people starting, like in their teens and using a bunch, as opposed to, people with fully formed brains, maybe in their late 20s, early 30s, using. Totally different animal, because that's where she's saying that the
Totally.
damage that they see to the white matter is in those younger people. And then, like, when you turn the corner and you have a fully functioned brain, she's saying that the research is actually showing stronger, white matter connection. So that's something I think really important. Like, I think it's something to bring to the attention of your children. Stuff like that. So I know
Totally.
my 16-year-old will be absolutely freaked out when she hears about that, and she won't smoke. She probably wouldn't smoke pot anyway, but because she's really,
A goody good.
yeah, she's goody good. But this will freak her out even more.
I
Yeah.
was very, very against it growing up. It was so funny.
Yeah.
So in like high school, I was like, absolutely not. No alcohol, no drugs, no nothing. I was very good. And it wasn't until I got into college that they had my friends, the baseball team actually made me try it. And then I was like on a whole other level and it was hilarious. I was laughing so much. And it's like, it's funny because then years later, people who knew me in high school, and then I would maybe like say yes to, oh, sure, I'll partake. And they're like, really? Like, you got on our case about it all high school. Like, I would be like, this is horrible for you. Like, I was so against it. But I'm glad to see that there's like research on it to allow us to understand like where it can be beneficial and where it can be harmful and, like walk the line you want.
Well, interesting show. You want to read us out?
Of course. Longevity Junky is created by Dr. Buck Joffrey, MD. It is executive produced by myself, Nikki Lee, Dr. Buck Joffrey, and Phil Ferragamo. We're distributed by our friends at ACAST. See you next time.